Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us, and then you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Our scripture reading today comes from the 10th chapter of Romans, verses 11 through 15. As scripture says, anyone who trusts in him, in Jesus, shall not be put to shame, for there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. In Greek mythology, Antaeus was the son of Poseidon, god of the sea, and Gaia, Mother Earth. And Antaeus was kind of a half semi-giant, I suppose. He lived in what today we call Libya and would challenge anyone who crossed his path to wrestle with him. But Antaeus had a little trick up his sleeve. As long as he stayed in contact with his mother, Mother Earth, he was invincible, he could not be defeated, and he crushed and killed one opponent after another. It was his ambition to build a temple to his father, Poseidon, made out of the skulls of all the people he vanquished in battle. So, he's not exactly a nice guy, okay? One day, Hercules, as part of his 12 trials, passes through Antaeus' territory. And Antaeus challenges Hercules to battle. Now, Hercules, as we know, had prodigious strength. He was sure that he could beat Antaeus, and yet once they were grappling together in this epic battle, Hercules realized Antaeus' trick. And since wrestling is normally about pinning your opponent to the ground, it presented a problem. How was he to beat Antaeus? Well, Hercules solved the problem by lifting Antaeus up off the ground, and while he was suspended in the air, crushed him into submission. It's a lovely story, right, to start a sermon. But Nassim Taleb, reflecting on this story, has this moral to offer us. He says, when we lose touch with the ground, when we lose connection with that which formed us and gave us life, we lose our source of strength. So we all need to keep our feet on the ground. The idea of this sermon series we're in, if you're just joining us today, we've been in a sermon series where I've been sharing about the faith communities that I've been part of as I've grown up and felt a call to ministry. The seed of the idea came from a friend of mine named Thad Austin. Thad is a pastor from Tennessee, but the last 4 or 5 years, he's been worshiping at St. Luke's United Methodist Church, where I was before I came to Zionsville. And Thad, was because he's from Tennessee and because he's a pastor, we had that instant connection. But not only that, he knows my hometown, Brownsville. His aunt and uncle live in that town and were friends with my mom. And so we had that kind of instant bond with one another. A few weeks before I came to Zionsville, he invited me out to lunch, knowing that my time at St. Luke's was coming to a close and I wouldn't be his pastor anymore. And so he invited me out to lunch, and while we're sitting there at lunch, he gave me a gift bag. And when I opened up the gift bag, it contained this jar of dirt. About a month prior, he'd been traveling to Tennessee and passed through my hometown, or near my hometown, and he pulled off the road, off the interstate, and he drove out to Tabernacle United Methodist Church, which isn't the church where I grew up, but it's a church outside of town that was built by my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaddy Taylor. And I think there's that many greats. I may have missed one or two, but And it's where we would, as kids, I grew up going to camp meeting once a year out at Tabernacle United Methodist Church. There's a whole campground built around it. It dates back to the 1820s, as you can see. And Dad went way out of his way, 45 minutes, just to bring me a jar of dirt. And I said, "What's this about?" And he said, "Well, Dave, I just want you to remember your dirt. Remember where you're from, and you'll do just fine." And so that's what this series has been about for me. It's been about sharing my dirt, in the best sense of the term. Not all the deep, dark stuff, but, the dirt, where I'm from, and the communities that have shaped my life. Because the reality is we all got dirt. Yes, the dark, deep stuff, but we all got dirt in the best sense of the words. We're all like Pigpen, surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. And you may not see the dirt, but we all bear with us the memories and the stories and the influence of people and places that have been significant in our lives. So we all got some dirt. This is going to be my last sermon to preach in this series, but I hope it's not the end of the story, because I surely hope and believe that this place will become part of my dirt. That your stories and your lives will shape. I'll keep carrying you wherever God may lead me in my journey. So since this is the last sermon, though, in the series, let me recap. We started off talking about Brownsville, Tennessee, where I was raised, and I told you about the church that nurtured faith in me to begin with. And then I talked about going off to college and the community of faith that surrounded me and helped me to hear and discern God's call. And then after that, I talked about Jamel and I both talked last week about the church community that we are part of in Haiti, and our experience, not just going in missions to Haiti, but experiencing, that sometimes we were on the mat, and that experience of being lifted and carried by others. It was a community that really showed us what it was like, not just to give support, but to receive support as well. And these become things that I think all of us as a church can do, that we nurture faith, we listen for God's call together, we support each other. But I close today by telling about the first church that I served back here in Indiana. It's the church that taught me to be a Hoosier, Milroy United Methodist Church. Milroy is a small farming community. Let me back up and just say that by the time I got to Milroy, my faith had been stretched. I had journeyed further away from home than any little boy in Brownsville, Tennessee would ever dream of. I'd gone to 2 elite learning institutions and had my faith stretched by philosophies and ideas and questions that I'd never considered before. In the process, I met my wife, who was not a volunteer, and so I would never go back to Tennessee to live again. She led me to Haiti, of all places. And there, I'd wrestle with questions of justice and suffering. And in the whole process, it was like my faith changed. And there were times where I felt like Antaeus, lifted off the ground, not sure where to get my bearings, I can remember one day in particular, I was sitting on the hill looking out over the Fondwa Valley, and I was praying, I was trying to pray. Because I remember even as I was praying, just kind of feeling like, God, I don't even know who I'm talking to. I believe in you, but you're just so much different, so much bigger. And it wasn't that God had changed, just that I had changed, but it still felt like, God, are you still the same Lord and Savior I invited into my heart when I was in 9th grade? Who am I talking to? Or as the disciples put it in the Bible, Lord, we believe, help thou our unbelief. And so in some ways, coming back to Milroy was the perfect place for me, because it reconnected me with my dirt. Milroy is in Rush County, about an hour southeast of Indianapolis. It's a farming community. Not a large town. Brownsville, where I grew up, was the county seat. Milroy was not the county seat. We only have one stoplight in town. That's kind of the kind of town. It was the only place I've ever lived where there was a significant Amish community. It was not, when you go to the local convenience store in town, you didn't just have parking spaces for cars, there were hitching posts for wagons. And the Amish, especially on Sundays, would always get out and kind of go for their Sunday rides, and their path frequently went by our house. Our dog hated it. The horses were its like mortal enemy, and it would go crazy. And even the Amish neighbors knew the name of our dog. They didn't know our names, but they knew the name of our dog. Sydney, stop! She thought she could take down a horse someday. But like I said, Milroy was a small town. Back in its heyday, it had a bank and a hotel and a car dealership. In my day, we were just hoping for a gas station, which a gas station did come, but after I left, so I didn't get to enjoy the gas station coming in. We had a lot of small businesses. There's Jackman Animal Clinic, Terhune Propane, Miller Hardwoods. There was the biggest business in town was Harcourt's Printing that printed school supplies for most of the schools in Indiana and beyond. And that one company employed about a third of the town. But the heartbeat of the town was the school itself. The school was located kind of in the center of town, but it was the heartbeat because the town over the decades had successfully fought multiple times efforts by Rush County to consolidate schools, because Rush County knew we could just save money if we just put all the kids in one facility up in Rushville. And Milroy had fought that along with some of the other schools in the county because they knew that if a community loses its children, it loses its future. And even though the building was old, it was a wonderful place, the Milroy School, because the teachers there, for the most part, had been there for 30 plus years. It was the kind of place where teachers were teaching the students, the children of former students, like whole generations. They just knew the town. Every kid was known. It was a lovely place. The Milroy United Methodist Church, it was right next to the school. In fact, we shared a parking lot. We used it on Sundays. They used it Monday through Fridays. And the Milroy Church was a place with a rich history. While I was there, we celebrated our 150th anniversary. And some of the pastors that it nurtured through the years went on to great things in our conference. Greg McGarvey, who was a pastor here, began his time at Milroy United Methodist Church. Terry Krause, who very recently was a member here and went into ministry, she followed me at Milroy about 4 years after I left Milroy. She was the pastor there. So we even have connections from Zionsville to Milroy. The church there was a wonderful place to be a pastor. Still, to this day, some of the best neighbors and friends that we've ever had. If I had to describe the church, I'd say there were kind of two chief characteristics to the church. The first is they really loved each other. They were a small, tight-knit community. They knew each other. And I didn't realize it, but I've learned as a pastor over the years, almost all of them were related to each other by some, like by marriage or by grandparents or so-and-so's sister. I mean, they were very tight and interconnected. And like most small communities, we knew too much about each other, right? Like there were no secrets. Everyone knew your business, but in the best possible way. If you were missing for a few weeks from church, someone would call on you. Someone would say, hey, how you doing? Are you all right? Like we checked on each other. We did life together. I remember one year a tornado came through town and it wiped out the barn of one of our farmers. Now, the barn itself was no great loss. It was kind of an old barn and he could write it off. The challenge was the debris that spread, for half a mile through his fields. And no machine could get that out of his fields without destroying the crop. And so to save his crop, the only way to do it was by hand. And so the whole church went out one day and just lined up in the rows of the fields. And we just walked down the rows, all of us, by hand, picking out any wood or metal or anything we could find. That's the kind of place it was. When someone was down or when someone had a need, we all rallied around each other. And not only did the church love each other, but they also really loved their community. They loved the town in which they lived. They were very proud of who they were. And they did everything they could to preserve. And so the church took seriously its role to be a meeting place, a place for the town to gather. And so all kinds of groups, social groups, parties, anything the town needed, we were the place, our doors were open wide. And sometimes that was, even like scouts and children's programs. We were the church that kind of housed most of those things. The only challenge for the church, which really wanted to love its community, is that we didn't know our community very well, which seems ironic, but the community was changing really fast, and it was tough to keep up with. Even the neighbors, literally across the street from the church, for the most part, we didn't know their names. And that's because they hadn't lived there very long. You see, most of the deep-seated people in Milroy, the families that went back multiple generations, most of the people who attended our church, they didn't live in town, they lived outside of town. They built farmhouses, nice homes, and so most of the homes in the town itself were for rent. And renters were more transitory. If there was any divide in Milroy, that was it. It was between renters and owners. And this isn't to kind of negatively describe renters, it was just kind of a general stigma that the owners had history in the town. The owners, went back multiple generations. The renters were just passing through. And they were doing their best to make it by. They were good people. They were trying to raise their families, and they chose a place where there were kind of family values, but they didn't stay very long. Something would happen every few years. Maybe they lost their job, or they couldn't make rent, or something would happen, and then they'd just move on. And in some cases, some families, when they would leave, move on, the property where they were was left in worse condition than when they moved in, because there's a difference in renters and owners and how you care for the place sometimes. And so sometimes the renters were blamed for the demise of the town. And if there's anything I really give Milroy, the church, credit for, it was that they wanted this to change. They wanted to know their neighbors. They knew that if they were going to survive and last as a church and as a town, they had to figure out, how do we love the people right across the street? And so they were willing to do anything. They were willing to change everything. So before I got there, they changed the worship styles. They went from doing all traditional to doing a blended service. They took out the altar. There's Margaret and Nathan. They were the worship leaders in the service. They weren't really the worship leaders. When you're a solo pastor, you have to shut everything down. And so they would go up front. Margaret would sing High School Musical. This is the time, and that's what she would do. And Nathan would kind of mimic her while I was shutting down everything in the church. It was always so cute. Anyways, they weren't the worship leaders, but there used to be a big pulpit there. They took that out to kind of open up space for a band. And it wasn't a big band. It wasn't like even the size of ours. It was just, 2 or 3 people playing guitar. But it was enough to kind of, for percussion, we didn't have a drum set. Instead, what they did is they put baskets of percussion instruments down at the front next to the altar. And they would invite the children to come forward for those first few songs and play along with the music. Now, it was cute when we had like 5 to 7 kids in worship, which is how we started. By the time, by my 3rd or 4th year, we had like 25, 30 kids out of a congregation that was only like 120. And it was so loud. Like you honestly could not even hear the people playing guitar. I mean, you couldn't even hear yourself sing. So, but that was okay. They were committed that this is what it takes to love our community. And those children, for the most part, started coming from an after-school program that we started. I shouldn't say we started. It was started again before I got there. It was called Monday Mania at first, and then we had to move it to Wednesdays, so it became Wacky Wednesdays. But this after-school program, it was the best way I can describe it is like we did VBS 1 day a week all through the school year. And it was that, we tried to hype it that big and make it that much fun for kids. And at its peak, we had 70 children. Now, the school only had 200 students, so we were bringing over a third of the student body on Wednesdays. They didn't line up to go to buses or for their parents. There was a special line for Wacky Wednesday or Monday Mania, and they'd cross the parking lot over into our church. And once they got in our church, all I can say is the people loved them. And we had a group of ladies that just were Phyllis, Sally, Doris, Melissa, I'm going to not name them all, and they all know this is going on the internet, and they're going to listen to it later and say you left me out, but Barb Malson, Chantel Fowler, they just loved every kid who came to those doors. And it wasn't just our church, I should say. There were two churches in town, the Christian church and the Methodist church, and we partnered with them, the Christian church, and their pastor was with me in doing this program. We just happened to house it because we were so close to the school. But man, those kids were loved, especially the ones who came from rougher homes where there was kind of a brokenness. It was like those adults I've worked with, they just had a radar and they could sense which kids needed the extra love and attention. And then we had the problem that a lot of churches have that have successful weekday programs. The question is how do we get those families to start coming on Sundays? How do we do that? How do we reach the parents? And so we weren't sure how to go about it, and then one of the farmers approached me and said, I feel like our church is so friendly, but people don't feel that way. They just see the outside of the building and it's intimidating. If we could just get them in the doors, it'd make a difference. And I know we can't do it on Sundays, but maybe some other time of the year. So he said, I'm about to sell off a lot of hogs. What if I donated one of them to the church? And we just did a hog roast. And you advertise it to the community, you get them there, I'll take care of the food. And so that's what we did. And it was around Christmas time, so we organized all these games, and we brought in Santa Claus, and the whole community came, 400 or 500 people coming into the church. It was awesome. And it was such a big blast that the next year we said, we need 2 hogs, and that's what we did, and it became an annual thing. And then we said, let's do this more than once a year. And so we started doing it 3-4 times a year. Anytime we had an excuse to gather the community, back to school, bash, Easter egg hunt, and every time, same farmer would say, I'll supply the food, I'll take care of that. Anything we could do to bring the family, the community in. And it wasn't just big bashes. We did prayer walks. One of my favorite things we did is the children of the church, on Maundy Thursday, we washed cars. Think about Maundy Thursday is when Jesus washed the feet of the disciples. And that's how they got around in those days. So someone in the church, I don't remember who, had the bright idea. We have all these cars that line up in the parking lot. All the parents who are lined up to pick up their kids after school. What if we washed their cars on Thursday, Maundy Thursday, and just simply told them we love you, and if you don't have a church, come see us at Easter. And that's what we did. We did anything and everything we could think of to love our community. And then something happened. Some of the community started coming to church. And it was slow at first. I remember, God love them, the first 1 or 2 families that came, because they were mobbed, like the church was so excited to see some of the new visitors. It was like blood in the water and sharks just frenzied around them, but God love them, they came back. And they brought back with them some of their friends. And it was like once we got the ball rolling, it kept growing. And it changed the spirit of the church in a way that I can't even describe. It was like we recovered our heartbeat in our mission because we were telling people about Jesus, It changed the way I preached and the ways I led Bible study because I couldn't assume that everyone knew the stories that I'd grown up with. It changed the way we did creeds. Because people would come in and they'd ask questions about the creeds that we never thought to ask. Why do you say I believe in the Holy Catholic Church? For those of you who don't know, it's a little c, not a big C, and Catholic means universal in Latin. But they would ask these questions, and it made us rethink everything we did. And I can honestly say it wasn't anything that I set out to grow or do. It was the Spirit moving in ways that surprised us. And what that church did for me is it helped me recover the word evangelism. By that time, I think the word evangelical or even evangelist had a taste in my mouth. And it wasn't just from TV evangelist, although that's, or But it always conjured those images, right, of the guy that sits on the corner with a megaphone and screams at people, or it reminds me when I was a kid and I was trained to tell people about Jesus, but it was like high-pressure sales techniques. Like you had to ask people, if you were to die tonight, where would you spend eternity? It was more fearful. It didn't feel like good news. When I was in high school, our youth group went to this leadership event. And at this leadership event, they were training us on how to do evangelism and teaching us how to ask the questions and walk people through the plan of salvation. And someone at this conference had the bright idea to take us 1,000 students and deploy us around the city. This was in Minneapolis, I think the conference was, to deploy us around the city. And so I got on a bus and I got dropped off at the zoo. And all of us were wearing like the same lanyards and everything, and we went around because we had a stack of tracts that we had to pass out. We were like on a mission from God, and they had really pumped us up that we had to do this. And I remember, I mean, it was so intimidating to approach someone that you don't even know and try to tell them about Jesus. And finally, I saw this guy who was with his family, and he looked kind and nice, and he was sitting back and watching his kids just enjoy. And I didn't know at the time like how big a deal it is for a dad to kind of be with his kids and like how precious that was. He just looked nice. And so I thought, well, he's a safe target. And so I approached him and I started to say like the lines that we've been programmed to say. And literally he cut me off and said, if I had a shotgun right now, I'd shoot all you Christians. And I don't blame him, because he'd been assaulted by all kinds of well-meaning people who were not sharing good news. We were just ruining his day with his family, because we had an agenda. Our agenda wasn't to love him. Our agenda was to, scratch a tally mark, another one for the Lord. I remember we went back that evening, and that's exactly what happened. They had asked all of us, how many people did you save today? How many people did you pray the prayer with? And that night they celebrated in worship, and all I could think of was how many people did we turn off, in the process? How many people did we push away from Jesus? So that was kind of my framework coming into this church. And then here I get to this church, and I rediscovered what evangelism could be. And that it really could be more like what Paul describes in Romans. How beautiful on the mountain are the feet of those who bring good news. Because our goal wasn't just to tell the good news to people, it was to be good news. That when any person in the community interacted with someone from our church, even if they didn't believe, even if they didn't step foot inside our church, we were still good news to them. We were still people who loved and cared and supported and lifted their spirits. That's what evangelism is about. It's about sharing good news. It's not a single person out there saving souls. It's a community. At least this is the model that I learned at this church. It's about a community, loving our neighbors, inviting them in. And when someone walks through those doors, we welcome and befriend them. That second word is important. Not just saying, hey, we're glad you're here, but we want to know you. We want to be your friend. See, to go back to the dirt analogy, the people of Milroy, they loved their dirt. They were a farming community. They loved their town. And it would have been so easy for them to just blame the renters for ruining the dirt, for messing it up. But that wasn't at all what they did. Their wisdom was to invite those who were on the fringes, those who didn't yet belong, and say, you know what, this can be your home. We love you, we care about you, we want you to belong. They offered up their dirt for someone else to put roots down in it and to make a home. Wendell Berry is one of my favorite authors. He writes some fiction, but mostly essays. In one of his essays, he distinguishes between two groups of people. He says people are either boomers or stickers. He says boomers are like, always chasing the latest boom. like going back to the mining days, if you think that's where the word comes. He's like, boomers are always trying to make it rich, make it big. They chase after whatever the latest opportunity is. And so their lives are always frenetic and busy. And behind them, they leave a wake of destruction, earth stripped bare and robbed of its resources. And they never amount to much. He says stickers, in contrast, they stick where they're planted. Their goal is not to make it big, but rather to make a home wherever they may be. And so they nurture and care for and steward the resources they have to slightly grow them and improve them and enrich them and then pass them on to the next generation. He says those who live a good and noble life, they understand that between the story of their life and the story of the place is more important. It's longer, it's more enduring, it's here before us and it's here after us. And so we don't use the place just to get rich. Instead, our mission is to make our lives serve the place, to enrich it, to steward it, to pass it on. That's what a good and noble life looks like. And so God has sent me to Zionsville. And I don't know how long we get to be here. I hope it's long enough that we can put down roots. I hope it's long enough that you all become part of the dirt that I carry and that my children carry through life. But it's not just that this place is a chapter in my story. If I listen to Wendell Berry, it's quite the opposite. It's that my story, my life, is just a chapter in the story of this place. It's bigger. It's more important. Your story is just a chapter of a bigger story that God is telling. And the question we get to ask ourselves is, what is our story going to be about? We're part of this big story of God so loving the world that he sent his only begotten Son. And that story has been passed along from church to church, from generation to generation, from place to place. What will our chapter in that story be? My hope and my prayer is that our chapter is about loving God well, and loving each other well, and loving our neighbor and our community well, enriching the dirt around us, and having something worth passing on to the next generation. Amen.